She could feel her fingernails. That's the first thing Renata Voss wrote when they finally gave her a pen and paper. Not that she was afraid, not that she was confused, not that she needed help. The first thing she wrote, after 14 days of lying completely still in a hospital bed while her brain fired and screamed and counted ceiling tiles until she knew every crack in every one, was that she could feel her fingernails growing, millimeter by millimeter, against the sheet. And she could not move them. Welcome to Haunting Stories. What you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing neurological accounts ever documented inside a U.S. hospital. Not because of what this condition does to the body. Because of what it does while the body is perfectly fine. Renata Voss was 31 years old. A third-grade teacher from Northeast Portland. She came into Cedar Grove Hospital on January 4th with a severe headache and elevated blood pressure. Routine intake. Routine observation. And then, somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight on her first night in the hospital, something happened to her that no one in the neurology department had ever seen before. She became completely locked inside herself. Not comatose. Not sedated. Not unconscious. Brain activity completely normal. Pain response normal. Vital signs normal. But Renata Voss could not move a single voluntary muscle in her body. She could not blink on command. She could not squeeze a hand. She could not speak. She could not turn her head. She lay in that bed for 14 days while her family stood around her, while doctors ran tests that all came back normal, while nurses changed her position every 2 hours to prevent pressure sores, and she was awake for every second of it. And she was not the only one. Dr. James Whitmore had been head of neurology at Cedar Grove Hospital for 11 years. He was 53, methodical, the kind of doctor who kept handwritten notes in addition to electronic records because he didn't fully trust systems he hadn't built himself. He had a reputation for being thorough to the point of obsession. His residents said he would chase a diagnostic mystery the way a terrier chases something it can smell but can't see, teeth first, completely focused, unwilling to let go. On the morning of January 5th, Whitmore got a call from the overnight attending about Renata Voss. He was at his desk by 7:15. He read the overnight notes twice, set them down, and went to her room. She was lying on her back, eyes open, oriented toward the ceiling. Completely still. Not the stillness of sleep, the stillness of something prevented. Her eyes tracked his movement when he entered the room. He noted that immediately. Eye tracking preserved. Some level of conscious awareness present. He stood at the foot of the bed and spoke to her, told her his name, told her he was going to help her figure out what was happening, and her eyes moved to his face and stayed there. He tried the standard tests. Told her to squeeze his hand. Nothing. Told her to blink twice if she could hear him. Nothing. Told her to look to the left. Her eyes moved left. So she could follow verbal commands, but only with her eyes. He spent 40 minutes with her that first morning. When he left he had 7 pages of handwritten notes and 0 diagnosis. The closest thing in the literature was locked-in syndrome, a condition caused by damage to the brainstem. But every scan of Renata Voss's brainstem was completely normal. No damage. No lesion. No bleed. Nothing. Whatever was holding her in place wasn't visible on any scan they had. By the time Whitmore got back to his office, a second call was waiting. A different patient on a different floor. Same presentation. Male, 64, admitted the previous day for cardiac monitoring. Overnight the nursing staff had noticed he'd stopped responding. Same story. Eyes tracking. Vitals normal. Brain activity normal. Could not move. Whitmore was in that room within 20 minutes. He stood at the doorway for a moment before entering, looking at the man in the bed, a retired postal worker named Dennis Carver, and felt the particular cold that settles in when you recognize something is wrong in a way you don't yet have language for. 2 patients. Same hospital. Same 24-hour window. Same impossible presentation. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern. By January 7th there were six patients on 3 different floors of Cedar Grove Hospital, all presenting identically. All conscious, all aware, all completely unable to control voluntary movement. The hospital administration had been notified. The CDC had been placed on a preliminary advisory. The Neurology department was running around the clock. Whitmore had not gone home since the 5th. What made the situation worse, what made it strange in a way that Whitmore couldn't shake, was the patients themselves. Because they were awake. They were in there. Every time he entered a room, their eyes would find him. Every time he spoke, there was response in the eyes. Not blinking, not communication, just the unmistakable presence of a person listening. He had started reading to them. Just something to do. Just to feel like he was giving them something while the tests continued coming back normal. He read the morning newspaper to Renata Voss on January 7th. She stared at the ceiling while he read. Her eyes moved to his face when he said her name. And something in her expression, something around the eyes themselves, the slightest change in muscle tension he couldn't fully explain, made him feel like she was trying to tell him something urgently and could not get it out. He went back to his office and sat for a long time. On the evening of the 7th, a fourth-year resident named Dr. Sarah Okonkwo brought him something. She'd been reviewing the admission logs, cross-referencing times, trying to find anything that connected the 6 patients. They didn't share a room. They didn't share a doctor. They didn't share a procedure. They had been admitted for completely different reasons and had ended up on different floors. But they shared something. Based on the nursing logs and the admission timestamps, every one of the 6 patients had been seen by the same orderly in the 18 hours before their symptoms began. Not as their assigned orderly. Just in their vicinity. Logged as delivering something, transporting something, appearing at the edge of a record as part of the routine background of hospital life. The same orderly. 6 patients. 6 cases. Whitmore looked at the name on the log. Badge number only. No name attached. A scanning gap in the electronic records, the kind of gap that happens when a new badge hasn't been fully integrated into the system, or when someone knows how to stay at the edge of the documentation without being formally attached to any case. He called security. He asked them to pull the footage for the badge number. Security called him back 40 minutes later with an answer that made his pen stop moving on the page. The badge number didn't exist in any current employee record. Whitmore didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office with the security logs in front of him and the growing case files of 6 paralyzed patients stacked beside them and tried to find the logic that connected everything. His mind kept returning to the orderly. A badge that shouldn't exist. A person who had been physically present, logged in passing, visible in records without being traceable. 6 patients. 6 contacts. Contact. He wrote the word in the center of a blank page and circled it 3 times. The next morning he pulled every nursing note from the periods immediately preceding each patient's onset. He was looking for anything. Duration of interactions. Nature of contact. Physical proximity. And he found something. It was in the nursing notes rather than the formal records, the observational shorthand that nurses use to describe the texture of a shift. In 3 of the 6 cases, a nurse had noted something about the patient's effect in the hours before onset. Not medical language. Just observations. Things like patient seemed distracted after orderly's visit and patient was unusually quiet after rounds, staring. He read each note twice. Then he drove to the hospital's physical therapy wing and found an empty room with a clock on the wall and sat in a chair and looked at the second hand and counted to 8. 8 seconds. It wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. 8 seconds of looking at a clock face and he felt nothing except the slight self-consciousness of a grown man sitting alone in a physical therapy room counting silently. But 8 seconds of eye contact, sustained, direct, unbroken, was not nothing. 8 seconds of eye contact was a long time. It was past the point of polite social contact, past the point of simple acknowledgement. 8 seconds of eye contact was the territory of deep conversation, of confrontation, of intimacy, of something that crossed an unspoken human threshold. He picked up his phone and called Dr. Okonkwo. "I need you to do something," he said. "I need you to go back through the nursing notes for all 6 patients and tell me if there's any reference to prolonged eye contact with anyone in the period before onset. Any reference. However it's described." She called him back in 2 hours. 4 of the 6 cases had it. Not formal notation. Casual phrases. Orderly seemed to hold patient's gaze, written by a nurse who'd noticed something slightly odd but not odd enough to flag formally. Patient made unusual eye contact with the man who brought the extra blankets. And the one that made Whitmore's jaw tighten, patient reported that the overnight orderly stared at her for an uncomfortably long time. Patient seemed unsettled. "I told her I would check on her in an hour." The nurse had checked on her in an hour and found her locked. Whatever this was, it moved through the eyes. Sustained eye contact, something like a threshold, and then something passed. Something that shut the door between the inside and the outside of a person and left them trapped on the interior. He had his hypothesis. He had no mechanism. He had no treatment. And he had a carrier. Moving through his hospital with a badge number that didn't exist. He went to hospital administration and told them to lock down the floors. To restrict visitor access. To require all staff to report any unusual interactions involving sustained eye contact. He knew how it sounded. He said it anyway. The administrator, a man named Phil Harder whose primary concern was the potential liability implications of what Whitmore was describing, told him to be very careful about how he characterized any of this publicly. That protocols would be followed. That the CDC advisory was being upgraded. Whitmore walked out of that meeting and felt the hospital around him differently for the first time. The corridors were the same. The fluorescent lights were the same. The particular smell of antiseptic and something underneath it, something human, was the same. But the people moving through the corridors, the nurses, the orderlies, the visitors, the patients being wheeled from one department to another, all of them had eyes. All of them carried eyes. And some of them looked up as he passed and their gaze found his for a fraction of a second and he found himself counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. He started walking faster. "Before I tell you what happened next, I want to read you something. This is from Renata Voss's account. She wrote it after her recovery, 14 days after onset. The condition resolved as suddenly as it had begun, and she asked for paper before she'd fully sat up in bed. She wrote for 3 hours. This is part of what she wrote. The worst part wasn't the first day. The first day I still thought it was going to resolve, that I'd had some kind of stroke event, that they'd figure it out and fix it and I would go home. I kept running through the list of things I had to do before school started back. I made grocery lists in my head. I was busy. I was coping. The worst part was day 4. Day 4 was when I understood it might not end. I had figured out by day 4 that I could move my eyes more expressively than I'd been doing. I don't mean I could communicate, I couldn't. But I could look at someone for a long time, I could follow them very deliberately, and sometimes people noticed I was doing it and came closer and spoke to me. So I started using my eyes like a way of calling people over. It worked about half the time. What I could not control was what I saw when they came close. I had a nurse, I won't name her, she was kind, who used to come in at the end of her shift and talk to me about her day. Just talk, the way you'd talk to someone who was listening, because I was listening, every single word. I heard everything that happened in that hospital for weeks. She had a daughter in high school. She was worried about her. I know things about that nurse that I'll never tell her I know because how do you say that? But on day 9 she came in and she looked at me and something was wrong. I knew it immediately. Her eyes were different. Not sick different, not tired different. Wrong different. Like the expression in them was slightly off from her face. Like the thing behind the eyes wasn't quite fitting inside the face correctly yet. She looked at me for a long moment and I wanted to scream and I cannot scream, and she said, "How are you doing tonight, Renata?" in her normal voice, and I could not tell her. I could not tell her that whatever had been in my room, whatever had done this to me, I thought I could see it in her now. She came back the next night and she was fine. Normal. Herself. I don't know what I saw on day 9. I think about it constantly. I think I need to stop thinking about it, but I cannot. That's where Renata's account ends on that subject. That nurse was Carla Sutton. She had worked the neurology ward at Cedar Grove for 7 years. She was 38. She had a daughter named Becca who was 14 and was struggling in her junior year, and Carla was worried about her, yes, exactly as she'd told Renata. Carla Sutton was one of the people Whitmore had asked to report anything unusual, any interaction that felt wrong, any moment that didn't sit right. Carla Sutton did not report anything. Because on the morning of January 11th, Carla Sutton arrived at Cedar Grove Hospital for her shift, walked to the third-floor nurse's station, signed in, turned to tell the departing overnight nurse something about a patient in room 304, and found that she could not open her mouth. The overnight nurse's name was Marcus Webb. He was 26, finishing his first year on the unit. He had been handing off notes to Carla for 2 minutes when he realized something was wrong. She had gone still mid-sentence. Not frozen in a startled way, not pausing to think, still the way a person goes still when something in their body has just stopped cooperating with their intentions. He called her name. Her eyes moved to his face. He called her name again. He recognized the presentation immediately because he had been watching it for 6 days on this ward. He was on the phone to Whitmore within 30 seconds. Whitmore was there in 8 minutes. He found Carla Sutton standing at the nurse's station. The condition had come on while she was standing, so she was standing, her hand still partially extended from the gesture she'd been making when it locked, eyes tracking the room, alive and present and utterly unable to move. They guided her to a chair, lowered her into it carefully, and she sat with the particular stillness of someone imprisoned rather than resting. Whitmore stood in front of her and looked at her face and felt something he hadn't felt in 11 years of medicine. Not uncertainty. Not the clean diagnostic puzzlement of an unsolved case. Something closer to grief. Because Carla Sutton was looking back at him with her full consciousness visible in her eyes, and she was terrified, and she knew what was happening to her, and there was nothing he could do about it except stay in the room and not leave her alone. He pulled a chair close and sat down. He said, "Carla, I'm going to stay right here. We're going to figure this out. You're going to be okay." He kept his voice as level as he could. Her eyes held his for a moment and then moved slightly to the left. A small shift. He followed the direction of her gaze. She was looking at the door. He looked at the door. Nothing there. He looked back at her. Her eyes came back to his face, and there was something urgent in them, something she was trying to transmit, and he realized she'd been trying to look at the door the same way Renata had figured out how to use her eyes to call people over. She was directing him. She was communicating. She had been locked for less than 15 minutes and she had already found her only tool. He said, "Do you want me to check the hallway?" Her eyes shifted left again. Twice this time. Deliberate. He went to the door and looked out into the corridor. At the far end of the hall, almost at the corner, a figure in hospital orderly scrubs was walking away from him at a steady, unhurried pace. By the time Whitmore had stepped into the corridor, the figure had turned the corner. He ran. He got to the corner in under 15 seconds. The corridor beyond it was empty. A long stretch of fluorescent lit linoleum, a supply room with a closed door, 2 patient rooms with open doors, a window at the far end looking out over the parking structure. Empty. Whitmore stood at the corner and his heart was hammering, and he stood completely still for a moment listening, and he heard nothing except the ambient sound of the hospital, the distant beeping of monitors, the ventilation system, somewhere a television in a patient room. He turned around. He went back to Carla Sutton. He sat down and took out his phone and texted security. "I need you to pull the camera footage for the 3rd floor north corridor, from the last 10 minutes. Now." He looked at Carla. Her eyes were on his face. "I saw someone," he said. I'm getting the footage. Her eyes moved left again. Then right. A new gesture. He watched it twice and understood. She'd seen it too. Security sent him the footage within 20 minutes. He sat in his office with the laptop and ran the corridor footage from the previous 40-5 minutes. The angle covered most of the third-floor north corridor from above. He could see the nurse's station in the lower left. He could see Carla arriving for her shift, sign in, turn to Marcus Webb, go still. He watched his own arrival, watched them guide her to the chair. Watched himself stand up and go to the door. He watched himself step into the corridor and look toward the far end. On the footage, the far end of the corridor was empty. He rewound it. Watched again. The corridor was empty when he stepped out. He watched his own figure on the footage look toward an empty hallway, pause, and then break into a run toward a corner at the end of an empty corridor. There was no one there. The corridor had been empty the entire time. He sat back from the laptop. Whatever he had seen at the end of that corridor, the figure in scrubs walking away at a steady, unhurried pace, it had not been there. The camera, which covered 80% of the corridor's length, showed no figure. No one in scrubs. No person walking away. Nothing. He had seen it clearly. He had seen the scrubs, the pace of the walk, the posture. He had seen it as clearly as he had ever seen anything. And it had not been there. Whitmore was a doctor. A neurologist specifically. He understood, better than most people, what it meant when a brain presented something to its owner that wasn't there. He understood the mechanisms. He had explained them to patients and families hundreds of times. He understood all of that. And he still knew with complete certainty that what he had seen was real. By January 13th, the case count was 11. 3 of those 11 were hospital staff. Cedar Grove had been placed under a formal CDC investigation protocol. The neurology ward was on restricted access. The story had broken in the Oregonian 2 days earlier with enough specificity that the hospital had released a carefully worded public statement describing an investigation into an unusual cluster of neurological presentations and reassuring the public that there was no evidence of a contagious illness. That last sentence was the one Whitmore had argued against. He had argued against it in the administrative meeting, quietly but directly, because they didn't know that. They didn't know anything yet. All they had was a hypothesis about eye contact that he hadn't been able to confirm and a pattern that pointed to a carrier they couldn't locate in any employee record. The administrator Phil Harder had thanked him for his input and released the statement anyway. Whitmore focused on what he could control. He had begun interviewing every staff member who had close contact with the affected patients in the hours before onset. Not standard interviews, he was Lou King for anything involving eye contact. Any moment that had felt unusual. Any person whose gaze had registered as wrong. 12 of the 14 staff members he interviewed reported something. Not all of them described it the same way. Some said they'd felt uncomfortable and hadn't been able to identify why. Some said they'd noticed someone looking at them in a way that made them want to look away. Some said they'd looked away. A few had not. He began to understand the mechanism. Not the biology, he was still nowhere close to the biology, but the behavioral pattern. The carrier made contact, sustained it. 8 seconds was his working threshold. Below 8 seconds, nothing. At or above 8 seconds, onset within hours. The body remained physically normal. The mind remained fully operational. But the connection between the two, the mechanism by which intention becomes action, the neural pathway between wanting to move and moving, that connection was severed. Not destroyed. Severed. Like a wire pulled from its terminal. Still intact, still capable of carrying signal, but disconnected from the source. Renata Voss recovered on day 14. Dennis Carver recovered on day 16. The others were at various points in what appeared to be the same trajectory. The condition resolved. It was not permanent. But while it lasted, it was complete, and the people inside it were conscious for every second of it. He kept coming back to that. Every second, he had now spoken with 4 recovered patients. All of them used the word trapped. All of them talked about the experience of hearing and seeing and thinking while having no outward presence in the world. All of them described specific moments, a family member crying, a doctor's expression changing, a television left on, that they had absorbed completely and could not respond to. One patient described watching his wife fall asleep holding his hand on the 4th day of his paralysis. She had pressed her face against his hand. He had been unable to squeeze back. He had been unable to make any gesture of comfort. He had lain there and felt the warmth of her face and felt the weight of her sleep and felt completely, perfectly separated from the world he was still inhabiting. Whitmore kept those accounts in a separate folder. He read them when the administrative pressure got too loud and he needed to remember what this actually was. He was reading them on the evening of January 13th when his phone buzzed with a message from the hospital's head of security. "You need to come see this." The security office was in the basement of Cedar Grove, a room that smelled like old coffee and electronic equipment. 3 monitors on the desk showed live feeds from various parts of the hospital. The EAD of security, a former Portland PD officer named Ray Solis, had pulled up archived footage on a 4th screen and was waiting for Whitmore when he arrived. "We went back further," Solis said. "Your request was for the week of the 4th. I took it back further. I went back to January 1st. He hit play. The footage was from the 1st floor main corridor, the wide hallway connecting the main entrance to the elevator bank. Timestamp, January 1st, 11:47 p.m. New Year's Day, the hospital as quiet as a hospital gets. The corridor was nearly empty. A nurse walking at the far end. A janitor's cart parked against the wall. And at the edge of the frame, coming in from what would be the direction of the loading dock entrance, a figure in orderly scrubs. The figure walked unhurriedly through the frame from right to left. It passed the elevator bank. It walked with the comfort of someone who knew exactly where they were going. And as it moved through the frame, just before the left edge cut it off, it turned its head. It turned its head and looked directly at the camera. It looked at the camera for a long time. Standing still in the corridor, scrubs, face slightly below the camera angle, looking up and directly into the lens. Holding it. Solis let the footage run and they both stood there and watched the figure look into the camera for what Whitmore, automatically, was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. What happens to the footage after that? Whitmore said. Solis moved his hand and pulled up the next segment of archival footage from the same camera. The timestamp jumped. 11:47 p.m. became 4:12 a.m. 4.5 hours of footage simply did not exist. The recording picked back up at 4:12 a.m. as if no time had passed. No gap indicator. No corrupted file message. Just an imperceptible jump from one timestamp to another and 4.5 hours of January 1st gone from the record. Whitmore stared at the screen. The figure had arrived at Cedar Grove on January 1st. 3 days before Renata Voss. 3 days before any of the documented cases. Whatever it was had been in the hospital for 3 days before the first patient presented. Moving through the building. Learning the layout. Looking at cameras for exactly 8 seconds and erasing what came after. Can you identify them? Whitmore asked. Solis shook his head. The face angle is too low. We tried to enhance. Nothing useful. He pulled up another feed. Here it is again. January 3rd. Another figure in scrubs, another corridor, another moment of the head turning toward the camera. Another timestamp jump. How many times? Solis pulled back to show him the full archive analysis his team had run. 11 camera locations. 11 separate recorded instances of the figure pausing and looking directly into a lens. 11 gaps in the footage after each one. We couldn't see its face in any of them, Solis said. Every single time it was either low angle or partial obstruction, or the frame cut off just wrong. Not randomly wrong. Wrong like someone who knew the camera positions and knew exactly how much face to show. Whitmore looked at the compilation on the screen. 11 moments of a figure in scrubs turning to look at a camera. 11 moments of something that moved through a hospital for days, methodically, apparently deliberately, apparently aware it was being recorded and apparently not concerned because the recording could be managed. "Do you have anything with its face?" Whitmore asked. Solis hesitated. "There's one more," he said. "This is the one I wanted you to see specifically." He pulled up the final clip. It was from a small secondary camera, a backup camera in a stairwell between the second and third floors. The kind of camera that wasn't part of the main security grid, wasn't logged in the standard system, was technically there for liability purposes in case of a fall. The kind of camera that someone mapping a hospital's surveillance network might not know existed. The figure was in the stairwell, coming down from the third floor. The camera angle was from above and behind, showing the back of the head, the scrubs, the pace of the descent. And then at the landing between floors, the figure stopped. It stopped and was still for a moment. Then it tilted its head back. Slowly. And it looked up. Looking up into the stairwell, looking at nothing visible, looking at an angle that would have been toward the secondary camera it had no documented reason to know was there. The face was visible. For less than 2 seconds before the timestamp jumped and the footage died, the face was visible. Whitmore leaned toward the screen. He did not recognize the face. It was a face that offered nothing, not age, not emotion, not any expression that mapped to a human state he could name. It was completely neutral in a way that human faces are not, the way a face is neutral only in photographs or in death. A resting absence of expression that on a living face in a stairwell in the middle of the night was more disturbing than anything else on the screen. And then the timestamp jumped and the face was gone. "We ran it through every personnel database," Solis said. "Current staff, former staff, contractors going back 5 years, volunteers, vendors. We got no match." "Keep running it," Whitmore said. His voice was steady because he made it steady. He went home that night for the first time in 8 days. He sat in his car in his driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. He sat in the dark and thought about a face with no expression and a badge number that didn't exist and a figure that moved through a hospital full of cameras and managed itself around every one of them except one. He thought about the patients. 11 people lying awake inside themselves, present for every moment, unable to communicate, counting ceiling tiles and fingernail growth and the sound of their family members breathing beside them. 11 people who had all, at some point in the 18 hours before their imprisonment, been in the proximity of something that looked directly at them and held their gaze long enough. Long enough. He thought about looking at the footage on the screen. He thought about the figure in the stairwell tilting its head back and looking up at the camera. He thought about how long that moment had lasted before the timestamp jumped. Less than 2 seconds. Much less than 8. Not enough. He thought about the 11 gaps in the surveillance record. 11 cameras. 11 8-second holds. 11 jumps in the timestamp. He thought about the one camera that had gotten less than 2 seconds of face before it went dark. Less than 8. Not enough to infect. But enough to be seen. Then he thought about this, the footage he had watched in Solis's office. Solis playing the archive for him. The figure looking at the camera. He had stood in that office and watched the footage and counted. He had counted out loud, to 8, watching a figure look into a camera lens. He had watched 8 seconds of a face looking into a lens and he had been looking at the screen. The screen. Containing the image. Of the eyes. He sat in his car and did not move for a long time. The next morning Whitmore was in his office at 7 a.m. He had made a call to the CDC at 6:30. He had emailed the hospital board at 6:45. He had written 4 pages in his notebook between 5 and 6, working through everything he knew and everything he didn't. He was fine. He was moving. He had full voluntary control of every muscle. He had driven to work. He had walked from the parking structure. He was fine. He told himself this at intervals throughout the morning with the deliberateness of someone who was monitoring something. By 10 a.m. the case count had stopped climbing. No new presentations overnight. The CDC team arrived at 2 p.m. He briefed them for 3 hours. He gave them everything: the hypothesis, the badge number, the footage gaps, the stairwell clip. He did not mention what he had realized sitting in his car the previous night. He told himself that was because it was speculative and premature, and he was a scientist and he needed more information. That was partially true. The other part was that he was 39 hours out from the viewing of the footage and he was still moving, and he didn't want to introduce a data point that might be wrong. C. Arla Sutton recovered on January 18th. She sat up in bed and asked for water, and then asked what day it was, and then was very quiet for a while. Whitmore came to see her that afternoon. She looked at him for a long time and then said, "There was someone in the corridor." He said, "I know." She said, "Did you find them?" He said, "We're still looking." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I saw it before. Not that morning. The week before, once, from a distance. I thought I was imagining it. Something about the way it moved." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I should have said something." He told her there was nothing she could have done. He told her she needed to rest. He told her the CDC was involved and the investigation was active and they were going to find answers. He sat with her for a while. Then he went back to his office and sat at his desk and was still for a moment. He flexed his fingers. He rotated his wrists. He tilted his head. He was fine. He was fine. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. He wrote the date. January 15th. He wrote the time. 4:47 p.m. He wrote the case count. 11 patients, all recovering or recovered. 0 new cases in 36 hours. Then he sat with his pen on the page and did not write anything for a while. The footage had been viewed by him and Solis. Solis was fine. Solis had not watched the segment the way Whitmore had. He'd been watching Whitmore's reaction rather than the screen for most of the key moments. Whitmore had watched the screen. Whitmore had watched 8 seconds of the figure looking at the camera, and he had been looking back. Through a screen. Through recorded footage. He had no way of knowing if the mechanism required live eye contact or if it could operate through the medium of a recording. He had no baseline. He had no comparison case. He had 11 patients and a growing hypothesis and the fundamental problem of being the one who had the most complete picture of how this worked, and therefore the one who was most likely to have been exposed to the vector they hadn't yet characterized. He was fine. He was certain he was fine. He was also a neurologist who knew that certainty about your own neurological status in the early hours of a potential onset was meaningless. The patients had all felt fine until they weren't. He wrote one more line in his notebook. "If this is my last entry, the stairwell footage. Solis has a copy. The face. Run it wider. Not just hospital databases. Wider." He put his pen down. He waited. This is where the documentary record of Dr. James Whitmore's personal involvement in the Cedar Grove investigation ends. His notes continue for 11 more days in a different handwriting. The CDC investigation team documented that Whitmore was found in his office at 6:30 a.m. on January 16th, seated at his desk, pen in hand, eyes open, vital signs normal, brain activity completely normal, entirely unresponsive to voluntary motor commands. He remained in that state for 16 days. His notes from his 11 days of recovery, the ones written in that different handwriting, smaller, more careful, the handwriting of someone whose hands are not quite under full control yet but are trying, describe the experience the way all the others described it. The awareness. The counting. The ceiling. The particular horror of being spoken about in the third person by people who don't realize you can hear every word. He also wrote something the others hadn't. In the middle of his recovery account, on what would have been day 8, he wrote this: "I have been thinking about the footage. About what it means that the mechanism can operate through a recording. If that is confirmed, and I believe it is, then the question of containment changes entirely. The footage has been shared. I shared it. The CDC team has it. Solis has it. Every person who watched that footage in the last 10 days has watched 8 seconds of those eyes looking at the camera and has been looking back. He listed 11 names below that paragraph. 11 people who had been present for screenings of the footage or who had been sent copies. He checked the names against the hospital's subsequent case records before he was well enough to write. 8 of the 11 were patients. The CDC filed its preliminary report on the Cedar Grove cluster on February 14, 2023. The report documented 22 cases of an uncharacterized neurological presentation, all resolved without permanent injury, all confined to patients, staff, and investigators who had direct contact with Cedar Grove Hospital's third-floor north wing during the month of January. The report noted that the origin of the cluster had not been determined. It noted that no pathogen had been identified. It noted that a subject of interest had been identified through security footage but had not been located or identified despite a national law enforcement inquiry. The report described the subject as an orderly of unknown identity, unknown origin, and unknown current location, last documented at Cedar Grove Hospital on January 13. The report did not include a photograph of the subject's face. The CDC team had decided, after consultation, not to distribute the stairwell image to anyone who had not already seen it. The decision had been made by the one CDC investigator who had reviewed it after everyone else who had seen it was already a patient. His name is in the report. He is described as the sole reviewing investigator for the image documentation. He recommended non-distribution. He made that recommendation on January 22. He presented for the condition on January 23. The image is currently in a sealed file. Somewhere, the orderly is currently in a corridor. Walking at a steady, unhurried pace. Not looking at the cameras. Or maybe looking at one right now. Maybe. Looking at exactly the right one, at exactly the right angle, waiting for exactly the right number of seconds. You have been listening for almost an hour. I wonder how many times you've looked at the screen. This has been Haunting Stories. Subscribe if you dare. Because the next story is already watching.